All right, so let's get going. I'll pass around the sign the usual. All right, so today we'll finish up our section on the 1960s, the promise and peril of the 1960s, focusing specifically on the rights revolution. All right, so we'll start by looking at the civil rights movement, which really gained steam in the 1960s. There's also a lot of backlash to the civil rights movement, it should be said, which we'll look at a bit. But SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is the main, is really the main group that's pushing this along. CORE as well, but it's really a student-led college students movement. So the Greensboro sit-ins, really famous, movement that happened in the 1960s, early 1960s. You can see white students and black students would just sit at lunch counters, and this is in Greensboro, but also in places like Miami, and they would just ask to be served. And they knew that this would rile up the locals. People would come out and, as you can see, dump things on them, spit on them, tell them, to get out of there, call them all kinds of nasty words, things like that. And again, this is in the context of anti-colonialism. The U.S. is trying to be a bulwark against communism. These activists know that these images are going to be beamed throughout the world, and it's going to create sympathy for their cause. So this is one of the essential tactics of Martin Luther King's nonviolent tactics. The Freedom Rides happened in '61, just a year later. Again, it's college students, activists who just get on buses, integrated buses, racially integrated buses, and they just stop at bus stops throughout the upper South, the deep South. Bus stops are segregated at the time, so they're challenging this immoral law. And as you might expect, lots of times when they get to these bus stops, there's violence waiting for them. You can see this bus was firebombed. The National Guard finally has to come out and escort the kids, the students, from one stop to the next. Again, this creates the perception in the mind of many that the federal government, federal troops are coming to the aid of these, agitators, these northerners, these outsiders. So it perpetuates that angst that Southerners during this time period in particular have for states' rights and loathing of big government, things like that. James Meredith gains admittance into the University of Mississippi. The Ole Miss rebels, of course. He doesn't make it known that he's an African American when he applies, so that's why he gets in. And then, once he's let in, he's lets it known that he's black. So there's all kinds of controversy that's created around it. When he shows up at campus, there's all kinds of riots amongst students, primarily led by the frat boys. Again, federal troops have to be called in. U.S. Marshals escort Meredith from one class to the next. They basically have to live with him to keep him alive. He's actually shot after the federal marshals finally leave. He's shot with a buckshot, a shotgun. He doesn't die, but he walks with a limp for the rest of his life, and he ultimately graduates from Ole Miss. There's the Children's Crusade in 1963. The local clergy in Birmingham, Alabama, get the kids to leave school en masse one day to walk out to protest the pervasive racism, racial segregation in Birmingham's public facilities. Bull Connor, the sheriff of the Birmingham Police Department, calls out troops to sick dogs on the kids, to turn the fire hoses on the kids. And again, like, these images are in a anti-colonial, post-colonial, Cold War context. They're being sent all throughout the world. So here's the dogs being sicked on the kids, of course. Shortly after, in the summer of '63, the Ku Klux Klan plants a bomb at a black church in Birmingham, detonated dynamite sticks, just sort of, they plant them everywhere. They kill these 4 little girls. So there's this, these types of things are making a lot of African-American activists more militant, more inclined to be open to the idea of violence, and less warm to Martin Luther King's notions of nonviolence being the way to pursue civil rights. In 1963 of the March on Washington, summer of 1963, late summer, hundreds of thousands of people assembled on the Washington Mall to hear all kinds of speeches, but keynote speaker was Martin Luther King. He gave his famous and rousing "I Have a Dream" speech. In 1965, February, you have Malcolm X is assassinated. He starts out as a really segregationist militant, open to the idea of violence to combat this pervasive racism in American society. He goes to Mecca after having a falling out with Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad had been stealing money from the Nation of Islam, had secret wives, not secret wives, just women he was getting pregnant. So Malcolm X starts to see Elijah Muhammad as a hypocrite. He moves away from the Nation of Islam. He seeks to get deeper into understanding what the true meaning of Islam is. He goes to Mecca. He worships next to white people as well as black people, people from all over the world. And he comes to see that he's been wrong about a lot of his views on segregation and violence. You might remember that we looked at this ad, this bread ad that Birnbach created for Levy's, where they're trying to appeal to not just Jewish consumers, but Birnbach originally wanted to have Malcolm X in the ad, but Levy's was like, no, I mean, he's a black Muslim, we're a Jewish company, like we just can't sort of like go along with that. So they put this kid in the ad instead. In 1965, there's a march on Selma in Alabama. You can see this massive group of people. You can see also how just deeply embedded the clergy were. Like Christians were very central to the civil rights movement, which is strange because today a lot of Christians like don't go along with civil rights at all anymore. They have sort of largely vacated. Christian nationalism tends to be pretty hostile towards civil rights today. But Bloody Sunday, as it came to be known, these guys, these civil rights activists led by King, who you can see here in the middle, and John Lewis right here, who just died during the pandemic. He's organized this event. They march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and they're warned that if they cross the bridge, that they'll be met with tear gas and violence. And sure enough, they were. Again, like these images of just these people peacefully walking over a bridge to be met with violence like this really starts to turn people into civil rights activists. You know, people who live in suburbs in the US or people who live in London or whatever, they become sympathetic to this when before it was just sort of ambivalent to race relations in the US. And there's two major landmark civil rights laws that are passed in early in Johnson's administration. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The provisions of the Civil Rights Act forbade discrimination on the basis of sex, as well as race in hiring, promoting, and firing. Voting Rights Act of 1965 by Lyndon Johnson outlawed discriminatory voting practices adopted in many southern states after the Civil War, including literacy tests as a prerequisite to voting. So you see this tension between states' rights and the federal government ebbing back and forth. All of these, voting restriction acts that have passed, I think, in like 38 states now since the last election. It's all the Supreme Court putting power back into the hands of state governments to decide their election laws as opposed to the federal government overseeing this. And again, even though these two landmark civil rights laws are passed in 64 and 65, there's still a slow pace of change in terms of integrating African Americans into an economy. Remember, they're largely pinned into decrepit cities, crumbling cities with lacking public services. It's much harder to get to jobs. It's much harder to get jobs. So there's a real sort of unrest that develops because even though these two laws are passed, really life at the grassroots doesn't change for most African Americans living in America's decaying cities. One of the major, longest, most deadly riots from 65 to 68 was in Watts. Went on for weeks. Hundreds of people died. But you can see this map from 65 to 68. Just everywhere there was these, urban uprisings, riots, whatever you want to call them. It was really a national phenomenon from 65 to 68, especially during long, hot summers. Stokely Carmichael coins the phrase Black Power in 1965 at a rally in Macomb, Mississippi. You can see he's speaking on behalf of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. And people, a lot of conservative whites are very offended by this notion of Black power. They have this sentiment of like, oh, well, why is it so wrong for us to say white power, but it's okay for Black people to say Black power? Like, Stokely Carmichael isn't saying that, you know, Black power means like keeping power away from whites. He's saying that Blacks should have power along with whites. And you see this dynamic still exists in American society. So anybody know who this on the left is?
Trayvon Martin.
Trayvon Martin, who's the guy on the right?
George Zimmerman.
Okay, so what did George Zimmerman do to Trayvon Martin?
From what I know, he just shot him over a bag of like Skittles.
Yeah, he followed him in Sanford, which is not far from where my mom lives. George Zimmerman sees this kid out in a black hoodie he's on his way to a convenience store, but George Zimmerman assumes that he must be out doing vandalism or some sort of crime. So he stalks him, he follows him with a gun, confronts the kid who's not doing anything wrong, they end up fighting. Zimmerman kills Trayvon Martin by shooting him. So what's the legal upshot of this? Go ahead.
Because Florida has a Sandra Brown law, he was acquitted.
Exactly. So he was defending his life, even though he followed the kid who was doing nothing wrong and ends up shooting him. A jury of 12 of this guy's peers found him not guilty of murder. And so after this, these two women, the women who ultimately started Black Lives Matter, on Facebook, they hashtag like, you know, how sad they are about the ruling in Black Lives Matter. And then immediately there's this backlash of like, oh no, all lives matter. And like, that's the whole point that the Black Lives Matter, you know, hashtag is trying to make, that like, yeah, all lives do matter, including this Black kid's life. But the fact that like there's this knee-jerk reaction to Black power and to BLM with ALM, I think speaks to how sort of deeply integrated racism is in American society, not just in the 60s, but even still today. So again, Stokely Carmichael changes his name after this guy, Kwame, I'm gonna murder this, I'm sure, Nkrumah, who led an uprising against the British in Ghana, and this guy, Sekou Touré, who led an uprising against the French in Guinea. Kwame Touré, Stokely Carmichael changes his name to Kwame Touré. But again, this, I think, gives you a good sense of how the civil rights movement in the United States is being fueled by post-colonial movements around the world, and how post-colonial movements around the world are being, you know, fed by the civil rights movement as well. You have the Black Panther Party is founded in 1966. Here's one of their, you know, propaganda posters, recruitment posters, or whatever. Here's Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, they created the organization. And one of their main things early on is they would follow police officers around Oakland. And if Oakland police was to stop an African-American, they would sort of just stand by and make sure that the civil rights of the person who was pulled over weren't being violated. They also have a breakfast program for kids. They basically give out, you know, thousands of free breakfasts throughout the course of a week to kids living in Oakland. And this spreads to cities throughout the country. In 1968, Martin Luther King, of course, is assassinated. So again, you have a bit of progress being made in the civil rights movement, but you also have steps backwards in terms of the leaders of this movement are being killed just as quickly as progress seems to be being made. Fred Hampton, the 21-year-old leader of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party, he's murdered in his bed while he's sleeping next to his pregnant girlfriend in 1969 by the Chicago Police Department. And you see in ads, I was hoping one of you would do a paper about Van Heusen, because it's hard to find a Van Heusen ad from this era that's not problematic. You can see how Africans are being depicted in this ad for Van Heusen compared to, you know, civilized white men. And you still have up to 1965 and a couple years after, you still have these products for skin whitening cream, creating the notion that whiter is beautiful, more beautiful than darker. You have segregated magazines such as Jet and things like that, where you start to have these ads of, you know, celebrities like baseball players who are consuming, which I guess seems like progress compared to the ads of the 30s, where they're just sort of serving pancakes or whatever, and they're not actually consuming. They're just in the act of labor. So here's Tommy Davis, who plays for the Dodgers. This guy plays for the Yankees. Elston Howard. This is a track and field star. He won the gold in the 400 at the 1952 Olympics. I find it hard to believe that he's actually a cigarette smoker. He's winning gold medals in the 400, but who knows? This is a famous singer of the era and a model. So Light It Up, Lucky. Again, like, starting to consume, albeit in segregated magazines. And in the beginning, it's mostly just famous African Americans who are portrayed in ads. But over time, you have just not famous people necessarily, models. But I like this ad, hypes up the space age as well. Again, sort of, you have these ads where you'll essentially have the same ad for white folks, just with Black people standing in. So again, just like the article that we read a couple weeks ago, the notion was that the advertisers assumed that Black people just wanted to be white people. So that's how they're depicted in a lot of these early ads from the 1960s. But again, there's changing demographics or changing dynamics of the demographic. You see consuming, hanging out, having a good time. McDonald's is really at the forefront of advertising African Americans, partly because McDonald's are building a lot of restaurants in poor Black communities, so that's really their target market. Again, you have the sort of housewife suburban scene here, but with Black people standing in for whites. Black romance, which is, I guess, a step in the right direction. Pepsi, of course, now it's Pepsi for those who think young, in contrast to the old folks who drink Coke. But you also have African Americans by the end of the decade being depicted doing white collar jobs, such as a vet in this Coca-Cola ad. You also see the aesthetic popularized by the Black Panthers, this blowout afro, this more recognition of African identity being seen in ads close to the end of the decade. This one in particular, I think he's like got the right on fist, but with the cigarette plugged in there. And even Santa is depicted as Black, which is really sort of monumental by the end of the decade. And again, this is a lot of times, mostly this is in segregated magazines such as Jet. But you also, by the early 70s, start to see these racially integrated ads where you have like, ethnics, not quite sort of like the, white, Northwest Protestant, the WASP or whatever, sort of like ethnic minorities, but still, whites, probably like Italian or Latin American or something like that. So small steps towards racially integrated ads. But again, things get better and they get worse at the same time. At the same time all of this is happening, these really crude blaxploitation films are becoming very popular, depicting Black men as hyper-violent, hypersexual, hyper-materialistic. It's sort of like a renewing of the minstrels of the 1800s that I think you see a lot of in the gangster rap of the 1990s as well. So this is Superfly Ron O'Neal, sort of like celebrating the pimp with the heart of gold. See this in car ads, cigarette ads. Gil Scott-Heron has this famous poem/song, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised," and he's really critiquing the way that African Americans are being depicted in advertising. And the whole message of the song is essentially that, just like Wu talked about in the article from Tuesday, the revolution is not going to be televised. No matter what images you're being fed on the television, you're still perpetuating the status quo and actually not part of the counterculture. So there's a lot of anti-gay sentiment through the 1950s, as we talked about. There's the lavender stare that's associated with McCarthyism. So I'll show you this PSA, this anti-gay PSA from the 50s that I think gives good context to what happens in the 60s.
Innocent enough, doesn't it? Lots of young people hitchhike. Seems like a good way to get from one place to another. But sometimes there are dangers involved that never meet the eye. So no matter where you meet a stranger, be careful if they are too friendly. One never knows when the homosexual is about. Let's take the case of Jimmy Barnes. Jimmy played baseball all afternoon and he didn't feel like walking home, so he decided to thumb a ride. He'd done it 100 times before. He didn't think anything was unusual when the driver struck up a friendly conversation. In fact, he seemed like a real nice guy. What Jimmy didn't know was that Ralph was sick, a sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious, a sickness of the mind. You see, Ralph was a homosexual, a person who demands an intimate relationship with members of their own sex. So no matter where you meet a stranger, be careful if they are too friendly, if they try to win your confidence too quickly, and if they become overly personal. One never knows when the homosexual is about. He may appear normal.
May appear normal. So anyway, in 1969, there's the Stonewall Uprising, which is considered the sort of real flashpoint that leads to the flowering of the gay rights movement. The cops had routinely just broken into, like crashed into gay establishments in the Lower East Side, all throughout Manhattan, really. This is in the West Village here. And this one time, they just get so fed up with it that they fight back. Comes like a huge melee, mass arrests are made. So the definition for gay rights movement is social and political movement of the late 60s through the mid 1980s that urged lesbians and gay men to engage in radical direct action and to counter societal shame with gay pride. And you start to see these, there's still hardly any ads in the mainstream media for homosexuality into the 21st century, well into the 21st century. But I found this ad that I think is sort of interesting for gay Bob come out of the closet, sort of like trying to capture that Barbie type of popularity of the era. And again, homosexuals are almost invisible in advertising, mainstream advertising into the 21st century. More recently, you start to see it. I showed you these ads last week, but you can start to see things changing over time. This ad I think is interesting because it's trying to capture that McCarthyism era of the 1950s Cold War, sort of shame and guilt and fear that's put into homosexuality during this period, where homosexuality is really driven underground. So you can see the percentages of homosexuality from Gen Z to baby boomers, just how the rates of homosexuality really have seemed to have grown over time. And there's a moral panic that's been created around this by people like Ted Cruz. I don't know if anyone saw the Ketanji Brown Jackson hearings, but he was basically trying to make her seem like she was out to make kids gay and make kids hate white kids. Ron DeSantis just recently, the governor of Florida, recently passed the Don't Say Gay bill, in which if a teacher were to have a picture of his husband or her wife on her desk, she could be fired for that. And the parents, if the kid is offended by that, could sue the entire school board. And these are probably, if Trump doesn't run, these are probably going to be your front runners for one of the parties. So these anti-CRT laws, equal memory laws akin to those passed in Stalin's USSR and Putin's Russia. This is an article that some of you read for extra credit, the Timothy Snyder. And you can see there's a new culture war and moral panic rooted in the sort of tradition of racism and anti-homosexuality in American society. So let's just compare the 50s to the 2020s really quick. So in the 50s, you have McCarthyism, the Red Scare era. You have the Lavender Scare, in which homosexuality is associated with leftism and anti-Christian, i.e. American values. The Civil Rights Movement was associated with leftism and anti-Americanism. And all of this is pandering to conspiracy theorists, particularly the John Birch Society in the 1950s and 60s. In the 2020s, educators and mass media, i.e. Hollywood and advertisers, are grooming children into homosexuality and need to be protected from the educators who tend to be liberal. CRT is, the fact that racism is deeply embedded in American institutions, is associated with leftism and anti-American values. And these, of course, are pandering to conspiracy theorists such as QAnon. So let's go back to this. All right, so Ted Cruz, Ron DeSantis wants you to think that it's Hollywood and advertisers like this popularization of advertisers today that, don't sort of like imbue a sense of shame on homosexuals. They're saying that this is the reason why there's higher rates of homosexuality. What if this has always actually been sort of like the norm, but there's always been this standard deviation, but people didn't feel as comfortable to come out because, there wasn't like Hollywood and advertising was making it seem like it was okay. And there's all kinds of shame associated with it throughout this Judeo-Christian, civilization that we've all been part of for so long. So just something to think about. All right, so let's shift gears to second wave feminism, which is one of the rights revolution associated with the rights revolution of the 1960s. So just a rundown of the waves, what we mean by waves. The first wave dealt with property rights and the right to vote. Through the progressive era, essentially, Gilded Age progressive era. Second wave focused on equality, particularly of pay and representation, and anti-discrimination. The third wave started in the 90s as a backlash to the second wave's perceived privileging of white straight women. The fourth wave began around 2012 and is characterized by a focus on empowerment of women, the use of the internet as tools, and intersectionality. The fourth wave seeks greater gender equality by focusing on gendered norms and marginalization of women in society. So what we mean by intersectionality is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and or oppression. We must consider everything and anything that can marginalize people: gender, race, class, sexual orientation, physical ability, etc. All right, so in 1960, the birth control pill becomes available for any woman who wants to take it, as long as she can get her doctor to sign off on it. So this is considered like a real revolution in human history. So why would this be so revolutionary? Go ahead.
Because it gave women autonomy to be able to have sex for pleasure and not for the process of procreation, but also it allowed for family planning, which really revolutionized, because at the time abortion was also, I think, the main part of the second wave feminist movement, birth control in general. And I think that this was sort of a marker of the idea of revolutionizing what a family would look like, and being able to decide how many kids you want and having them later in life.
Yeah, exactly. So think about it in terms of like a labor context. Like in a labor context.
Sorry, I don't necessarily know what you mean.
Well, so like women wouldn't have to leave the workplace, right? Like they could, if they wanted to, they didn't have to sort of like leave the workplace for 9 months at a time. They could just stay and work at the same rate that men were working, so they wouldn't be falling behind. They wouldn't be getting passed over for promotions, at least in theory. So it makes women sort of like equal in terms of their labor capacity if they so choose with men. The Feminine Mystique is a famous book that comes out in 1963, written by Betty Friedan. She basically argues that women are, captive in this comfortable concentration camp of the suburban home. She finds, being a housewife really like soul crushing, soul stealing. But there's all kinds, as soon as the second wave feminism, women's rights really comes to the fore, there's an immediate backlash to it, led primarily by conservative women who believe that a woman's place is in the home, and that all of this notion that Betty Friedan is espousing in the Feminine Mystique is really wrong-headed. So this is Phyllis Schlafly, who's very staunchly against women's rights. You can see she's at the head of stopping the Equal Rights Amendment too. One of the main goals of the second wave feminists was trying to get an Equal Rights Amendment put into the Constitution, and this woman successfully defeats that movement, or that effort, I guess I should say. So you have Roe v. Wade in 1973. SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the U.S., ruled that the Constitution of the United States protects a pregnant woman's liberty to choose to have an abortion without excessive government restriction. One of the unintended consequences of Roe v. Wade is that Catholic and Jewish voters who were traditionally aligned with the old left's labor politics start to vote in far greater numbers for the Republicans, of course. And this hasn't changed. It's only sort of, grown over time. Catholics used to be predominantly associated with the Democratic Party, so did Jewish voters. That's completely changed nowadays. It's about 50-50 for Jews. The Catholics are like 70-80% Republican now. But you see that Texas has passed a nearly total abortion ban. So has Oklahoma. So again, we have a conservative conservative Supreme Court now. They're putting power back into states' jurisdiction to decide, what their voting laws will be, what their sort of abortion laws are, things like that. But again, just like I said, this was an unintended consequence where Catholic and Jewish voters leave. The more that the Republican Party gets sort of behind keeping women from having reproductive rights, that could end up blowing up in their face later on. But here's some ads from the era. You can see this would be in a women's magazine. This is for Dormeyer, where you would give this to your husband and basically circle everything that you wanted for Christmas, all of these home appliances. Again, you see this still very prominent in the 1960s of the idle housewife with free time, thanks to her new appliances. This, I think, is an interesting ad. It's a bit grotesque modern. You have the husband standing on 2 feet, holding up the child, the woman sort of off balance. But if you read the text, it's actually not geared towards a family at all. It's for a single man. It says, "We all know a woman's place is in the home, cooking a man a delicious meal. But if you're still enjoying the bachelor's life and don't have a little miss waiting on you, then come down to Hardee's for something sloppy and hastily prepared." So it's the image is selling you that 1950s suburban ideal, but the text is selling you the bachelor's life and Hardee's by the bachelor's life. Here's another Van Heusen ad. I think this is somewhat grotesque modern as well, where you have the guy standing solidly on his 2 feet, the women, down on their knees or looking up to him. This as well. We have in the 1950s and 60s, more TV programs coming online, including exercise shows for the housewife to do to keep fit during the day before her husband gets home, things like that. So Jell-O is essentially trying to capture that craze. We have all of these stereotypes still deeply embedded in advertising, including seemingly progressive companies like Volkswagen, at least compared to the American car companies, where like women, of course, are bad drivers, but she'll be safe if she's in this VW Bug. Women made for women's extra feelings. You can see this is trying to. So this is for deodorant. So women have extra feelings, they sweat more, so use secret. You still see the trope of is violence towards women really such a bad thing? You can see the tagline, is it always illegal to kill a woman? This one sort of woman can't get her hair the way she wants, so she's thinking about taking poison or blowing her brains out. But she doesn't have to because Charles Antel Formula 9 in shampoo saves the day. This would be for like a local ad in Chicago. Do you still beat your wife? And this is like, well, maybe you should, it's probably for her best interest in your own happiness. This one, blow in her face and she'll follow you anywhere. Yeah, that'll turn. This one is, women are great at home is the sort of text part. It's like, yeah, women are great at home, but they suck at things like, climbing on mountains, so let's not drag them along. You get this real, a lot of ads that you see depict men as cavemen during this time period. So again, you have these, progress seemingly being made, but also steps backwards at the same time. It's just sort of like American History 101. This one as well. This one. It's nice to have a girl around the house, like a stuffed tiger or whatever, or tiger rug. This one is hyping up like playing Ring Around the Rosie, but rather than a broom, it's this girl who's being used as the broom. Keep her where she belongs, on the floor and loving shoes. This one, think about her as your mother, for selling the flight attendant experience on American Airlines. This one, the woman's being compared to a car. I think this is a bit grotesque modern as well. She's like bent lower than the guy standing firmly on the ground. This one comparing a woman to a Honda motorbike. This one comparing the woman to a household appliance, but also meant to attract the male gaze. This one also meant to attract the male gaze, as is this one. I think these are sort of like the maiden form ads that we saw too, where they're trying to depict women as more advanced roles in life, like a dental hygienist or a violinist, but still sexualized. These are ads for little girls, obviously, the Susie Homemaker. So you can be like your housewife mom, this one as well. So here's a Barbie ad from the era that I think is interesting.
I think we should explore a few solutions.
Grabbing the suggestions,
If you were Barbie, the glamorous teenage fashion model doll by Mattel, you would have a fabulous wardrobe created for you by Mattel's famous designer. Like this spectacular form-fitted evening gown, handcrafted with exquisite detailing. Zippers that really work, rich satin lining, matched accessories in minutest detail, perfect workmanship in every beautiful costume. Always the newest, most elegant style. Only Barbie has such a magnificent wardrobe, such a variety of hairstyles and colors. And only the genuine Barbie has this very special tag to tell you that she's the one and only Barbie. If you were Barbie, you'd insist on the best. And Barbie is the best, made only by Mattel. Just $3 wherever dolls are sold. You can tell it's Mattel. It's swell.
All right, so here's a Xerox commercial, which I think captures a lot of the tropes of sort of like the dim-witted, you know, just sort of object of a woman.
I can't type. I don't take dictation. I won't sharpen pencil. I can't file. My boss calls me indispensable.
Miss Jones,
Just a minute.
will you make a copy of this?
Naturally. I push the button on the Xerox 914. I make perfect copies of whatever my boss needs by just turning a knob and pushing a button. Anything he can see, I can copy in black and white on ordinary paper. And am I fast? I can make 7 copies a minute. By the way, I never need wet chemicals. My 914 is a dry machine, powder dry. Sometimes my boss asks me which is the original, and sometimes I don't know. Here, Mr. Smith, I'm going to lunch with Mother.
All right, so you see rates of depression amongst working women and housewives really skyrocket in the 1960s. There's all of these new pharmaceuticals available to curb their anxiety or their depression or their sense of ennui or whatever. This is just for Xerox. So this would be target marketed for, say, a domestic worker, maybe a housewife. You could read it either way. Xerox, this would probably be for a housewife, a sedative. So again, it's just pervasive. These ads really show up all over. Butasol. I think it's interesting how the little girl is dressed like a little like Native American as well. Marathol Thorazine. So this is like a tranquilizer. This is for methadone, which is one of the main ingredients in methamphetamine for diet pills. So it's essentially like selling the woman speed so she can keep her weight down. So I don't know if any of you have taken speed, but yeah, I mean, from what I've heard, you don't have an appetite if you eat Molly or whatever.
Well, this is not an anecdote about speed, to be clear. But my grandmother described taking these diet pills in the 70s, and she was bipolar actually. But yeah, she said, like, I mean, clean the whole house and not be hungry or tired.
Yeah. If you've seen Mad Men too, Betty Draper, Don Draper's wife, gets like hooked on speed as well on methadone. And you see by the late 60s, this, women's rights, second wave feminism start to, advertisers are trying to sort of like make nods towards it in ads. So up off your knees, girls, shine final, the no X floor is here. I never even thought of burning my bra until I discovered Smirnoff, that you can see is still meant to attract the male gaze and attract the guy. And, you know, it's trying to have it both ways. There's a lot of these ads do. Virginia Slims in particular really tries to capitalize on feminism, feminist movement, women's rights movement, however you want to refer to it, where you can see she's got a toolbox, which is traditionally a men's, you know, thing to have, I guess. And it's, you know, these cigarettes, they're thin, dainty cigarettes that are designed to appeal to women as opposed to your dad's Marlboros or whatever. This one you can see is trying to appeal to, you know, the sort of Black Panther type of Black nationalist market to some degree, as well as the feminist. The two movements, you know, were very much intertwined, I think. This is interesting, the tagline, "You've come a long way, baby," but under here it's, as the 1980 Minterville Fireman's Ball, Miss Joseph Moran defiantly lit up a cigarette. Her husband was really burned up. So again, you get that sense of like Bernays trying to market cigarettes to women like they're liberty torches. This is basically a redux of that same campaign that Bernays came up with. This one as well, you can see in 1915, Miss Cynthia Robinson was caught smoking in the cellar behind the preserves. Although she was 34, her husband sent her straight to her room. So again, liberty torches. This, you get a sense of the, you know, complete inversion of sexism. We make Virginia Slims, especially for women, because they are biologically superior to men. But of course, down at the bottom, "You've come a long way, baby." So these ads are showing up in major publications such as Newsweek, which has a cover story about women in revolt. So the Freedom Spray, Massengill, deodorant spray. This one I think is very sort of strange too. Germaine Greer, she's from Australia or New Zealand, I can't remember which, but she's a very sort of like outspoken, like critic of the misogyny deeply embedded in Western civilization, English society, American society, Australia, New Zealand, etc. But in this same ad, you can see, maybe you can't because it's cut off there, a saucy feminist that even men like. It's a very strange title for your article about a sort of like militant feminist. And inside the magazine, you have a maiden form ad of sort of, you know, objectified women. Again, standing off balance, you know, like that grotesque modern aesthetic to it. So I'll show you this quick video that gives you a good sense of how deeply embedded sexism was in the news coverage of the feminist movement of the era.
The women's liberation movement despises the playboy concept of women, who they say may have been liberated.
When it comes to showing the women's rights movement on TV news, this is how some reporters first portrayed it leaning in.
Nothing but sex objects have got to go.
I think television news both hurt and helped the feminist movement.
She's a housewife in training. Rare is the girl who wants to be a doctor, an engineer, or a pilot.
Vanderbilt communications professor Bonnie Dow analyzed television news coverage collected by the nationally honored Vanderbilt TV News Archives.
And some of the depictions of the movement that I talk about in the book are certainly the root of the stereotypes that afflict feminism to this day.
Between you and me, the only equality that exists is in the cemetery.
The women's rights movement had been going on for years before the big three networks took notice in 1970.
There are so many moments in that coverage from 1970 when news workers are, you know, openly disdainful or dismissive or, you know, simply overly amused by the idea that women might have something worth fighting for.
Here's a story about women in the military.
So it would be obviously impossible to fly a regiment halfway around the world at a moment's notice when at least half the regiment could simply never be ready on time.
Other TV coverage from that year gave balanced reports on key feminist issues like the Equal Rights Amendment, childcare needs, and lawsuits over employment discrimination.
The Southern Pacific Railroad had refused for the fourth time to promote her from clerk to station agent. The reason was California laws said women cannot work overtime nor lift more than 25 pounds.
And they would in fact use visuals, that is, use the camera to show these women who had filed these lawsuits, to show them doing the job that the law said they couldn't do.
legal and social practices that relegated women to second-class status have been abolished.
Though women have made major strides in the last 45 years, Dow says the fight for equality in business, leadership, and politics still has a long way to go.
One of the things that is very difficult for people, and one of the things that this coverage really demonstrates, is how uncomfortable angry women make just about everyone.
This myth of male protection of women does not exist.
So Native Americans are also wrapped into this rights revolution. They have all kinds of real heavily covered uprisings, I guess you could say. They occupied Alcatraz. Alcatraz is, of course, a prison off the coast of San Francisco. It had been abandoned. And so Native Americans take boats out there and just sort of set up shop there. And their argument is that, like, look, I mean, you guys took this land from us originally, so we're just taking it back since you're not using it. The feds finally come and escort them out. They also occupy the Bureau of Indian Affairs building and basically hold it, much like the Columbia students did. But the federal government doesn't send in troops. They actually make concessions to, make life better for Native Americans stuck on the reservation or Native Americans who are going to cities to look for work. Also occupy Wounded Knee. Anybody remember why Wounded Knee, we looked at it at the beginning of the semester, is so important in American history? Good.
Yeah, it was like a battle, I believe it was like in 1890, and I believe the US Army went to go and like confiscate some guns from Native Americans. They didn't want to give it up, and there was like a confused scuffle, and it ended with like a lot of civilian casualties.
Yeah, the main thing was that it was on the Sioux reservation in South Dakota, and the Sioux were doing the ghost dance, which they had been outlawed to do because the Christians who lived around the reservation were very freaked out by it. They thought that the Sioux were conjuring the devil, but they kept doing the ghost dance, trying to bring the buffalo back, which they had lived, had been their monoculture for time immemorial. The federal troops are sent out to stop them from doing the ghost dance. They don't stop, so they just mowed down. Hundreds of Sioux Indians. So the Sioux go back to Wounded Knee and occupy that. Federal troops are finally called in. It becomes a real violent clash. Leonard Peltier was found guilty for shooting an FBI agent. I think he's still in jail for that. But you can see ads of this era. We looked at this a couple weeks ago. This is again the Bird Box Levy's bread ad. You can see this Native American smiling as he says bread. This is very sort of social realist advertisement that became popular in the Depression era. You can see it makes a comeback in the 1930s, just drab colors, straight on photography. I think this is the same guy in this cornflakes ad. So cornflakes, Kellogg's is essentially just ripping off the Levy ad, which was so successful. You can see this U.S. Navy recruitment poster of the Native American sort of traditional dress with the new Navy whites. I think this is like a code talker here, but also you can see the rocket being employed in the background, trying to capitalize on the space age craze. This is for cartridges, carbines, rifles, but you can see that sort of traditional dress. This I think is an interesting ad of this Native American doll. It just looks like a white girl who's sort of been made to look like a Native American, really. But again, it's important to note that the hippies were really sort of involved in the Native American like aesthetic as well. They start wearing beads and moccasins and things like that. So again, all of these groups are really feeding off of each other under the umbrella of the counterculture, which we'll get to in just a second. So here's another problematic Van Heusen ad. White men have been fantasizing about Native American women since Sacagawea, I guess. But these are like two white women dressed as Native Americans, and seems like very interested in it. But the tagline is, of course, they'll be wild about you. All right, so here's a famous ad, Keep America Beautiful, which transitions nicely into the rise of modern environmentalism. But you can see how the Native American is.
America's become cleaner thanks to something called the Clean Community System. Changing the way people think about trash and pollution, the Clean Community System makes a city so clean, the citizens simply refuse to let it get dirty again. But though many communities are part of the system, many more aren't. resources. Write for this free booklet. With a clean community system, our whole country can be a cleaner place to live in.
That's the famous crying Indian ad. Anyone know what tribe he belonged to? Iron Eyes Cody? He was Italian. He wasn't Native American at all. But he really cashed in on the notion that he was. And this all sort of like, again, like all of these groups are shaping what's considered the counterculture, and part of the counterculture is the new environmentalism. Rachel Carr is central to this movement. She writes this famous book, The Silent Spring. She basically discovers how DDT, this poison, is essentially in everything. It's in your food, it's in your drinking water, it's in the air you breathe, and it's really cancerous. There's Earth Day that's begun in 1970, the first Earth Day during the Nixon administration. You have things like the whole Earth catalog that are published and distributed throughout the country. You can subscribe to it, and it basically gives you instruction in how to live a more sustainable lifestyle, where you're not putting so much pressure on the environment. Teaches you to build things like biospheres and things like that. Teaches people about recycling. Nobody recycles during this time period. You have the Environmental Protection Agency becomes a federal agency during this time period, also during the Nixon administration. One of the flashpoints for the creation of the EPA was the Cuyahoga River caught fire. So this is outside of Cleveland, and it was basically just like a dumping ground for car companies to just sort of like, put their discarded stuff there. All kinds of companies would just dump things into the Great Lakes and the rivers, and there's no governmental or entity to keep companies from doing this. And since it was convenient for them and cheap for them, they just did that. So you can see this is the Cuyahoga River again outside of Cleveland. You can see just the rust and chemicals in the water. And this is right next to one of the most major cities in the United States, right in the heart of the industrial heartland, the Rust Belt. You can see how gunky the water was by the early 60s. It actually catches on fire. You've got a real problem when water catches on fire. And here's a before and after picture. This is thanks to the EPA, the intervention. Sort of, you can see the cars all lined up here, and then over time it's all removed and cleaned up. So again, as I said, the counterculture is at the center of all of this. So the new left is really what's the driving force in the counterculture. They tend to have their fingers in every pie that we've been through so far, from feminism to Native American movement to civil rights. So what we mean by the new left is the breaking away from the old left's focus on the struggle between capital versus labor and unionization. The new left campaigned for a broad range of social issues such as civil and political rights, environmentalism, feminism, gay rights, abortion rights, gender roles, and drug policy reforms, and especially against the Vietnam War. So this gives you a good sense of all of the things that buttons became very popular, patches became very popular amongst the counterculture. So these are just some of them. You have like the NFWA, the Chicano movement, sort of like, you can just see the vast range of it. Free Angela Davis. So the free speech movement is also one of the central movements within the counterculture. So I'll play you just really quickly Mario Savio's part of the speech, which is really the, I think does a good job of summing up the spirit of the 60s.
Win at work by communicating effectively. With Grammarly, meet time. He is being.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Yes, he was really one of the luminaries of the New Left. He was a student at Cal Berkeley. Jean-Paul Sartre, a French philosopher, is also one of the driving forces in the New Left. Combined existentialism and Marxism into a political philosophy uniquely sensitive to the tension between individual freedom and the forces of history. I believe that societies were best understood as arenas of struggle between powerful and powerless groups, not merely capital and labor. Herbert Marcuse, you can see here with Angela Davis, who was one of his grad students. He believed that liberation could not be achieved from any system, either socialist, capitalist, or any other. He advocated breaking down all systems in order for humans to attain true liberty and equality. He wanted radical liberation of the human condition, which was far more radical than Marx. So an example was he advocated if you were a heterosexual, that you should engage in homosexual sex in order to sort of like, push the boundaries of what your identity actually was. You have Marshall McLuhan, who you may have read about in Woo last week or Tuesday. He saw the media as having become extensions of humans, i.e. technology as dehumanizing weapons of mass distraction. He argued that the medium is the message, which relates to what we talked about with Woo in terms of even if you're watching the counterculture on television, you're still tuning in for the ads and actually perpetuating the status quo. But anyway, what he meant specifically by the medium is the message is the forms and methods used to communicate information have a significant impact on the messages they deliver, including the meanings and other perceptions about those messages. He added the expression implies that the form of communication being used, whether meaning book, podcast, social media posts, etc., video games, will affect the perception of the message that it delivers in some way, even perhaps if the same message is communicated with different media. Timothy McLeary is also central to the New Left. He's famous for saying turn on, tune in, drop out. And this was derived from a Pepsi jingle. He actually spoke with Marshall McLuhan about how to convince people to pay attention to his message. And Marshall McLuhan is actually the one that says you have to think about this in terms of advertising. Philosophers have to be able to sell their ideas to a mass audience. So that's how they came up with the tune in, turn on, tune in, drop out, as I said, derived from a Pepsi jingle of the era. And he proposed turning totally to religion and or spirituality to escape materialism, capitalism, and socialism. You have, by the late 60s, all kinds of major American publications, such as Newsweek, having cover stories about LSD, hippies in Post magazine, Life magazine, a whole story about life on communes. So again, the counterculture is being pushed to the center of American society in some ways during this time period by the so-called status quo organizations or mass media such as Life. One of the epicenters for the counterculture is Haight-Ashbury, a neighborhood in San Francisco, where young kids, people inclined to sort of new left politics or the hippie movement, sort of are attracted there all through the mid 60s. So this color image, you get a good example, a good shot of what the clothes would look like at a music festival. People sort of wearing face paint, like body paint, things like that. Summer of Love in 1967. It's primarily in San Francisco, but really it's all throughout the country. But there's all kinds of concerts in the summer of 1967 where kids are traveling from all over the country to sort of just live in the park there and listen to music, take drugs, etc. Woodstock in 1969 is also a major, gathering of this countercultural generation. Jimi Hendrix National Anthem seems to be symbolic of this new spirit that has developed in American society, especially amongst college kids and young people. Easy Rider is considered the counterculture movie of the 1960s. I'll show you the movie trailer for it. One of your classmates is doing a paper on trailers.
It's the story of a man who went looking for America and couldn't find it anywhere. Easy Rider stars Peter Fonda.
It's not every man that can live off the land, You do your own thing in your own time. You should be proud.
Also starring Dennis Hopper, the award-winning director of Easy Rider.
Now, look, I gotta get out of here. We got things we want to do there. Like, I just can't get out of here.
Co-starring Jack Nicholson.
They got this here, Scissor Happy Beautify America thing going on around here. They're trying to make everybody look like you old Brenner. This used to be a hell of a good country. I don't understand what's going on with it.
Everybody got chicken, man. That's what happened.
You gotta run. And let the captain tell. Wherever man lies.
thought of myself as a freak, you know. Grew up to freak. No, man. This is grass.
You mean marijuana?
Look like a bunch of refugees from a guerrilla love-in.
Oh, I just can't believe, what are they doing here?
I don't never know, but I don't think they'll make the parish line.
Well, outside, we're scared the hell out of them.
They're not scared of you. They scared of what you represent. Oh, we represent to them, man. Somebody needs a haircut. Oh, what you represent to them is freedom. What the hell's wrong with freedom, man? That's what it's all about.
So you get a sense of how different trailers have become from then to now. So one of the main advocates or people to come out of the counterculture shaped modern America today, 21st century America, Steve Jobs. You can see how these print ads really try to cash in on the counterculture. So this girl's wearing like a mod dress, sort of like a 1960s, early 1960s dress, but you start to see the hippie colors, the bright pinks and yellows embedded in this Honda ad. So here's a Levi's ad from the early 1960s. Take a mental note of how austere and cowboy it looks. Here's another Levi's ad, this kid going into the schoolhouse or whatever. So here's the Levi's ad by the end of the decade. You get a sense of how deeply imbued the counterculture, sort of like hippie look, has been in mainstream American society by this time period. This one as well is for like a flower child who presumably hasn't necessarily showered that day, but she can still use Listerine. Here's for Clearasil soap. Here's for Woolworths, which is a traditionally very conservative company. You can see this is like more sort of like that 1920s, like 1930s look, I think. So by the end of the 60s, you have it changing to this sort of like Jen is truly outrageous type of look. And this as well, Woolworths ad. This is for a liqueur. Pepsi, of course, cashing in on this. This is for body paint, which becomes like a popular item to take to Woodstock or wherever. You have all these patches become very popular. So to your vest or whatever. But Jesus Christ Superstar becomes very popular in the early 70s. So I think there's interesting bell bottoms, colorful shirts, jeans that turn a dude into a stud. But even like really conservative companies, like car companies, like this is for Ford, they're cashing in on this. Plymouth, even GM, which is basically selling you how great the stereo in the car is, because kids love their music. This is for Wrangler jeans, which is very conservative. Nowadays if you see Wrangler, it's always like people in cowboy clothes, but even Wrangler was trying to cash in on that hippie aesthetic. This is for a bank. Campbell's, of course. Rolling Stone becomes a thing in 1970, trying to really market the counterculture, sort of like be the voice of the counterculture in American society. Mad Men had a season 1969 to 67 where the counterculture was very central to the storyline. The very last episode, I don't, this is a spoiler, but I doubt you guys are really gonna find that. But the last episode, Don Draper, he sort of like burns out and has like a real existential crisis. So he travels across the country from New York, he quits his ad agency, and he ends up at some like hippie retreat on the West Coast and gets into meditation. And the last scene of the show is this commercial, like he imagines this commercial here. So I'll show it to you.
I'd like to buy the world a home and furnish it with love. Grow apple trees and honey bees and snow white turtle doves. I like to want to sing with me. Perfect harmony, perfect harmony. I like to ride the world and keep it company. That's the real thing.
But you notice how all the Coke bottles have like Coke written in like different foreign languages as well as like the American.
Keeps the world safe in perfect harmony and feel like I like to buy the world a Coke and keep it company. It's the real thing. It's what the world wants today. It's the real thing. It's what the world wants today. It's the real
What you see is Coke out Pepsi. But also capitalizing on the anti-war sentiment, the counterculture sentiment, the post-colonial sentiment of, all of these divergent cultures like joining hands around Coca-Cola, like Coke is this uniting force of peace. Go ahead.
I was gonna say that's one of my favorite ads of all time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I really, really like this ad. The way, the way it was done, the way it was shot, all the people coming together, all around Coca-Cola. I mean, granted, I don't drink Coca-Cola. I'm not a soda guy, but I just love this ad.
Yeah.
It's just so cool.
You know what's funny about Coke is I never drink Coca-Cola either, except for in December of every year, because the only time my mom would buy Coke was around Christmas time, because that's the only time she had it. So it's I really crave Coca-Cola none of the year except for around Christmas. I really have a Jones for it. All right, so again, I think this sort of ads that we looked at on the counterculture really sort of tie back to the Wu stuff that we read on Tuesday. And it's the ad men were so confident that the counterculture of the 1960s would not be the end of advertising because desire's most natural endpoint is consumption. And advertisers, after honing their art for half a century, knew how to convert all manner of desire into demand for products. Young people, even hippies, were no exception. And capitalism's resilience and adaptability is what makes it so powerful. Capitalism is the perfect chameleon. The sole purpose is profit, so can cater to any desire. Even disgust of consumer society and disgust of capitalism itself can be channeled into profit making, i.e. the Che Guevara t-shirt that became so popular 10, 20 years ago. All right, so I think we'll save our discussion of chapters 20 through 22 since we're running short on time. We'll mix that in. So with Tuesday stuff. So just looking ahead to next week, we'll look at the U.S. after Vietnam and ads of that era, of course. We'll discuss Wu's chapters 20 through 22, which we didn't discuss today, but also 23, 24, 25. So make sure that you're ready to discuss that. And then Thursday, we'll look at what's the future of advertising, and then read Wu's chapters 26 and 27. So have a safe, happy holiday weekend. Enjoy the weather. Oh, yes, that's right. See you guys.
I don't think
Oh, they are. Oh, they are.
I don't. I just feel terrible.
Two sources that I use secondary. I'm just choosing the. I'm thinking about using the three-thing sales ology one. Where it's using kind of portfolio, shoes and how.
Yeah, I mean, I would think probably the easiest fit for that would be the Chapman one, the civil rights one. Because you see Jordan sort of transcend all of that, barriers that were put in place in the 50s and 60s. Jordan, yeah, he just transcends that. Otherwise, compare Jordan.
Yeah, all right. Thank you.
Sure. All right, I was gonna say, for Maya Jillian, since we had the same topic, she's doing food. She's doing something food related. Okay.
Oh.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
I got it at 3:30 in the morning.
Oh no.
I wasn't surprised you didn't.
Oh no. Also, something cool that I found. We're not talking about this at all, but I found some old school New York City subway tokens.
Oh wow, yeah. Interesting.
Which are really they're from this time period.
Cool.
So
I
just
love
thought
your
those
belts.
were-
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
That's
Quick
great.
question. Is the final going to be similar to the midterm?
Yeah.
Like the take home, I mean?
Yep. Yeah.
And then also thank you for the grades for.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for your work.
Also, I didn't get grades for my primary and secondary yet.
Yeah,
as well.
I'm gonna do that,
Okay.
between classes.
Okay,
Thank
all
you.
right, sounds good. Thank you. Have a good weekend.
You too. Take care.